Hi, everyone. Thank you so much. And thank you, Gamzee, for giving a very good introduction to all the ways that it's really difficult to preserve, Gamzee, and to Vic, for giving an introduction to how difficult it is to actually preserve privacy. So in today's talk, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a slightly different problem. So instead of talking about genomic privacy, I'm going to be talking about medical patient databases, of course, which there might be some genomic data in there, but we're going to be talking about medical databases generally. And this is joint work with Alexander Layden, who is currently a research fellow at Harvard Med School. And this is a problem I started working on when I was a postdoc at Harvard Med School with Griffin Weber. How do I advance the slide? Is there? Oh, there. Okay, great. So when I'm going to be talking mostly about federated queries today. So we're going. Some clinician, some scientist wants to know how many patients have hypertension across an entire network of hospitals. And so you send your query out to hospitals 1, 2, and 3. They all send some amount of data back to some central party, and you get a result. And there are several different aspects of privacy and security that we should be talking about here. Of course, there's the privacy of the result itself. So does the result of that query reveal stuff about the patients? But there's also the privacy of the intermediate computations. So can you trust that central server to not reveal any information? Or are you even allowed legally to trust that central server with confidential patient data? And this gets back to what Hoon was talking about with HIPAA laws, PIPEDA in Canada, and as well as a GDPR in the EU. And there are several different approaches to privacy of intermediate computations. One thing you can do is you can add noise. So whether that's through differential privacy, through the mechanisms that Gamzee was just talking about, or any of a number of other techniques for adding noise and basically saying, well, you're not revealing too much about an individual if you've added noise so that you can't really figure out the private medical data of an individual or whether a patient participated in some study. We're going to be talking a little bit about a slightly different approach that involves making use of compression, which is my background in genomic data compression, as well as making use of homomorphic encryption and secure computation. And the reason for this, so let me talk about the types of queries we're going to be going through first. So we're going to be talking about these count queries, and I apologize for the low resolution of that. So suppose you're hospital 1 and you have 100,000 patients that all have hypertension, and you want to send some amount of information to the other 2 hospitals so that together you can figure out how many total patients have hypertension. Well, the naive thing to do is, well, you just send, I have 100,000 patients. Maybe hospital 2 says they have 80,000, and hospital 3 says they have 50,000. You add those together, you get 230,000. But of course, that's only an upper bound because there's some chance that a single patient goes to multiple hospitals. So how do you deduplicate that? Well, that's a little bit difficult. You can also give a lower bound. So there are at least 100,000 patients with hypertension across all 3 hospitals, but it sort of gives a really big range. And it's not entirely clear how you figure out how many patients exactly have hypertension without deduplicating. Another approach is, of course, to send a bunch of hashed patient IDs all to a central party. And of course, they can deduplicate there, and that gives you an exact number. So maybe there are exactly 168,000 patients with hypertension across the 3 hospitals. But of course, this requires that everyone trust the central party, which sometimes is fine with legal protections. But on the other hand, makes it really difficult to do this kind of broad analysis if you have to always send all of your private data to some central party. There are other techniques which we're going to be talking a little bit more about, which involve making use of some sort of secret sharing. So I'm using this sort of broadly because there are a number of different techniques that we're covering here. You can make use of these summary statistics. You can make use of homomorphic encryption, but you're going to send some kind of bit string that's not easily connected back to individual patients. And the estimate and error depend on the method you used, whether you're using homomorphic encryption, whether you're just using some sort of probabilistic sketch, etc. And so this was work that I did with Griffin Weber at Harvard Med School, just giving these different approaches to estimating the number of patients for these sort of federated queries. Now, the particular technique we were using is the sort of compression technique known as probabilistic sketching. So what we're doing is, instead of sending actual patient IDs, we are just using some sort of coordinated random sampling, where you take all your patient social security numbers or some other identifier, you hash all the values, and then you bucket them and you take the minimum values within each bucket. And we are also taking the log of those values. And then you can merge these sketches easily. And then by just taking the maximum across each of the hospital sketches, which is provably the same as if you had done this sort of process on the original unit of data set of all 3 hospitals to begin with. And you can estimate the counts from this. So the formulas, we don't need to go into too much detail yet, but basically from these sketches, you can estimate the total number of patients in the union after deduplication across all 3 hospitals, with some amount of accuracy depending on the size of your sample. So you should think of this as some version of random polling. So you're basically polling each of these hospitals with some small sample of the patients and using statistics to power it up, but then using hash functions to allow you to do deduplication. Unfortunately, this has problems. So as we've been talking about throughout the session, this is not actually very private. So for example, if we have a patient, Bob, who is Y years old and has rare condition Z, and I want to know if he has diabetes. Well, I could just send several queries. I could send a query Y and Z, and then send queries Y and Z and diabetes, and Y and Z and not diabetes. And that, and that may, the results of those queries may reveal things, especially when we're talking about hyperlog sketches. The adversary already knows Bob's, assuming the adversary knows Bob's ID, they know what bucket Bob hashes to. And if that bucket changes in either of the latter queries, the adversary immediately learns Bob's disease state. And so basically, the central problem here is this problem of utility and privacy that Gamze was just talking about. Deduplication is, by its very nature, antithetical to privacy. If you can deduplicate a patient, if a hospital publishes any kind of information that allows the patient Bob to not be double counted, well, then clearly an adversary can just simply try counting Bob and see if anything changes. And so this is a fundamental problem with any kind of technique that allows you to do deduplication. And even if you can't add noise to it, that noise is precisely going against the deduplication. And so this is sort of fundamental to what exactly is privacy in this sort of context, and how does it relate to the types of information we need. This is a bit of a contrast to something like GWAS, where you're really interested in learning something scientific about the population. Here, we're actually literally interested in counting patients. And so that makes this problem a little bit harder in this sort of framework. And indeed, there have been several papers recently. So there was Desfontaine et al. Published a paper showing that cardinality estimators just in general don't preserve privacy. And that really gets back to this deduplication. But that's with a sort of strong form of privacy. You might wonder, well, maybe you can have some weaker form of privacy. It turns out that you can't even do very weak forms of privacy. So for those of you who are already in the privacy literature, you'll be familiar with things like k-anonymity. And it turns out that hyperlog sketches don't even give you very much k-anonymity. And this is where we get back to using secure computation. So what we're interested in is we're going to use these hyperlog sketches to compress our data, basically. Since it turns out that a lot of these secure computation methods, homomorphic encryption, are still quite slow. And so operating on really large amounts of data is still quite difficult, especially when you're a clinician interested in real-time queries. So to give you some background, for many of these sorts of clinical query systems, the clinicians actually want responses on the order of seconds, or maybe a minute or two at most. And so they're not going to be willing to wait around for a couple of hours for some complicated homomorphic encryption protocol to finish. You need the things to be fast. And so this is why we need to have some compression in order to, before we do our secure computation. And I'm just going to cross out the differential privacy here, because unfortunately that is going, if we add differential privacy to the sketches, that precisely destroys the deduplication property that we are using the sketches for to begin with. Okay, so this is the general overview of the protocol. So I'm going, a general overview of the protocol. So basically, you send your query to your network, you get back to some encrypted data, you do a homomorphic computation on it, and then you do a multi-party decryption on just the answer, which is just an integer output with the results of your query. And so you don't reveal any of the intermediate hash values or buckets. The only thing you're revealing is the response to the query, which of course may reveal data as well, but that's something that you can be protected with other techniques. So maybe you want to use differential privacy at that stage after you've already deduplicated. Let's see, I'll talk a little bit about some of the technical details we had, but so we made use of existing homomorphic encryption library Palisade as a sort of black box. We made use of BRNS, which gives fast addition and slow multiplication of integers. And one of the things I sort of want to mention is that from my perspective as a user, I don't actually understand all of the crypto. So there's a lot of really, really clever mathematics going on in the crypto. I don't actually need to know that, because all I need to do is I can treat it as another platform. So in theory, you can do any computation, because you can rewrite anything as a combination of addition and multiplication. But in practice, it's slow if there are too many multiplications and not feasible for complicated functions like exponentials and inverses. Now, what from my perspective, what that means is that I have some computing platform, some black box computing platform that is really, really good at certain types of operations, just like a GPU is really good at certain types of operations. But if you want to write software for it, you need to change your algorithm a little bit to take advantage of this new platform. And so that's what we did. So the key is just to rewrite these count queries with the complicated formulas that we gave earlier as a combination of addition and multiplication. So now you might be wondering, wait a moment. So the formulas that we were giving a moment ago, they were quite complicated. They weren't really just addition and multiplication. Not just that, like there were some hidden operations in there as well. So just taking maximums. Maximums aren't addition or multiplication. So what do we do there? So there are a couple tricks that we can use. One of which is because we've compressed our data so much. So we compressed our data. These are log space estimators. So we've managed to shrink it down by a factor of 2 logs. And so we can give up some of that. And so we actually give up one of the log factors by expanding out our data set into unary notation. So we exponentially blow it up once, but that's all right because we've compressed it down twice in terms of log factors. And that allows us to basically do maximums as just a single multiplication operation, which is quite nice. And then we also have this ugly formula to deal with. So it has exponentials on your ciphertext. It has multiplicative inverses, and that's really, really difficult to work with. Luckily, it turns out that if we go back in the literature, and this is part of why I think it's important to understand the sort of history behind algorithms. The algorithm on the left here is something that was developed over the course of multiple decades because we got better and better at extracting little bits of information out of these sketches with these complicated estimators. However, the original algorithms that came out weren't nearly so clever. So the original log-log algorithm only made use of a single exponentiation operation on a summation of the bucket values. And notably, we can combine all of the encrypted the bucket values together as just as summation operations. And addition is fast. And so basically what we've done is we've reduced down this count query algorithm to log n multiplications to do the maximums, as well as a bunch of additions which are effectively free. And then afterwards, we can take the exponentiation in plain text because there's nothing there that we can't derive from the query itself. There is some cost to this. So the accuracy of the fancy estimator is about 1.04 over the number of root of the number of buckets, whereas the one on the right is 1.3 over the number of roots, square root of the number of buckets. But that sort of blow up doesn't really much matter at this point when we're using homomorphic encryption. So to summarize, fully homomorphic encryption can be really slow if you don't write your algorithms properly. And I assume we're going to hear a little bit more about that in the next talk. It can be fast if you change your algorithms correctly. So you can, and in my case, if you heavily compress your data before you throw it into the homomorphic framework, you can get a reasonably fast computation. And we are able to get, you can't quite see, but we're able to get runtimes on the order of seconds, which is quite important because we are interested in these real-time queries with deduplication. So on the order of less than a minute, we can do these things, depending on the number of parties and the number of buckets and accuracy. But the sort of take-home message is that homomorphic encryption really is ready for prime time if you're able to be clever about rewriting the algorithms to the type of platform that homomorphic encryption is. And with that, I think that is about it. So I know we're running low on time. So thank you all so much for coming, and I look forward to hearing the remainder of the talks.